please put your hands together for Dan Fagan.
All right. Hi, everybody, and hello to those of you who are joining us online. Welcome to our first in-person Kavli conversation in at least 2 years. Well, our first fully in-person Kavli conversation in 2 years with guests and everything. We're thrilled to be able to do this. My name is Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of journalism at NYU and the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program and the Science Communication workshops at NYU. We are serious about promoting, training, encouraging in every possible way we can humane, evidence-based journalism on all topics that have something to do with the world of science, health, and the environment. And I certainly feel like the topic that we'll be talking about tonight absolutely does. As always, we're very grateful to the Kavli Foundation, Stacey Bailey in particular, for making these possible. Also very grateful to Caveat for hosting us. Totally recommend Caveat as a very cool place for these events. And a special shout out to Caveat founder Ben Lilly, who suggested this topic, and it was a great idea. We're very thrilled to be doing this. For those of you who are online, if you have questions, my suggestion is that you use Twitter and use the Kavli Convo hashtag, KAVLICONVO. Use that hashtag, and we will see it, and we will try to work your questions into the conversation. And for those of you who are in person, we totally encourage you to ask questions. Just come line up here at the mic, and Molly will see you, and when she's able, she'll work your question into the conversation. Asha and Carl, thank you so much for being here. We're very, very grateful. And I'll leave it to Molly to formally introduce you, but it is my privilege to introduce Molly, who is doing a Kavli conversation for the first time, but definitely not the last. We're thrilled to have her. Most of you know who Molly is, but I'll just say that she's the senior correspondent at Radio Lab, where she's done a whole series of amazing stories. But I specifically recommend Gonads, her series, which is absolutely fantastic. But really, she does a lot more than that. Long ago, she was my student at NYU SHRP.
25.
SHRP 25. And since then, she's done a whole series of amazing things. And today, I think of her as a full-scale journalism entrepreneur. She's a presenter, an author, a writer, and she's an actress. She's a real movie star. You can check her out in Come On, Come On, starring Molly Webster and, oh yeah, also Joaquin Phoenix, where Molly is playing a public radio producer, reporter. So it's host. Oh, sorry. Host. So it's a pleasure to welcome Molly to this position, and she's going to be hosting many more of these, we think and hope and expect. So Molly, take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm assuming, is it fine that I'm holding the microphone and that I gave up on the stand? Yeah? Okay. Back there, I'm getting a thumbs up. You do whatever you want. So very excited to be here. It's so awesome just to do an in-person thing and to see like real people and to like get energy from that. I feel very lucky to be here because these two are great friends, and I feel like I'm just gonna absorb their mojo, and then you get to absorb their mojo, and no pressure. And yeah, and so on the far left we have Asha Bandele. Ooh, nice.
Bandele.
Asha Bandele. And Asha is a former senior editor at Essence Magazine, former director at the Drug Policy Alliance, an activist, a mom, an amazing memoir author. Go read The Prisoner's Wife. and on and on and on. So it'll be really fun to see all the ways you get to jump into the conversation.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks, Dan.
And then we have Carl Hart, who's at Columbia, neuroscientist, psychologist, author of Drug Use for Grownups. I'm trying to memorize this all because I was like, that's more fun. And so, you know, the topic, we're here to talk about drug legalization. I'm not gonna, we're just gonna jump right into it. My hope is for moving through this is, you know, we have 75 minutes. I sort of want to move through getting to know each of them a little personally and like how they stepped into the sphere, and then thinking about some of the science and statistics that they're like unpacking, and then taking a step back, like for all of us who are trying to do journalism in this room and thinking about like how do we cover this stuff. It's like this idea for the conversation for me is actually loosely modeled off of a SHRP class that we had when I was in SHRP, which is like eons ago at this point, but was we would have scientists come into the room like once a week, and every week was a different topic, and they would just like download to us, and then we had to figure out how to write about it, and get it wrong in the process, but then we would do it in a classroom, and so we can all pretend this is a classroom here. So just to start, maybe Asha, if you could talk to me about like how did you step into the world of thinking about drug legalization?
Thanks, Molly, and thank you all who are here and all of you who are joining us online. Thank you to Team Caveat, the team that's also ensuring the live stream. We appreciate you all. Thank you, Robin Hart, Carl's beautiful wife, who has done so much work and always ensures we're here, and is also a great friend. But thank you most of all to Carl Hart. It's difficult for me to put into words what Dr. Hart means to me and to my family. As a journalist myself, but mostly as a daughter and as a mother, having someone in my life who helped ensure that I could critically think, that I could know how to seek truth in places I didn't know I had to ask questions, and who did it with an abundance of love, a love that can't be measured and a love that was unbound, is a gift that can't be measured. Thank you, and I love you. Carl's also the author of the best-selling text that's used on drugs and science, the author in 2013 of High Priced, a memoir of his journey into this field, and finally, last year, the author of Drug Use for Grownups, which is one of the bravest books that anyone could ever write. And so I just wanted to level set, in that way that, we're in rare presence tonight. And I'm grateful that I get to be in rare presence personally.
You're too kind. You're too kind.
Honest, I'm a journalist. I can be fact-checked on everything I've just said. So, Molly, I think, what brought me to this space is maybe a little less interesting than what kept me here. I came into this space because there were a lot of people being locked up who were both in my family. My stepson had been held in the jail in the Bronx for 18 months for almost no amount of marijuana, cannabis, which is now legal. And while he may have come home after 18 months, he never returned from prison, and eventually would wind up costing him his life. A very gentle spirit and gentle soul. He didn't find his way back, but it was the mass incarceration and the wielding of the drug war that brought me here. The Rockefeller drug laws were still in place at the time. This was probably 2005 when they were making the first reforms to that. What kept me here was that I was in a place where people sought to tell the truth. And that is my role, and yours, as a journalist, right? What is the actual fact? Where's the evidence? Prove it. Show me. Make it make sense. And so what kept me here was that I met people who didn't assume that, didn't use slogan as strategy or scholarship. They used scholarship as scholarship and strategies as strategies. And I found that learning that in one area provides great service in every area of your life. And no one held forth more for me in that regard than literally the world's leading expert on drugs and drug science, the world's leading neuropsychopharmacologist, say that 3 times fast, literally consulted by heads of state around the world. And when I really came to know Carl, I knew of him, but when I really came to know him, I was like, oh, okay. Because I promise you, nobody else has gotten me out in this COVID. I promise you that that's true. So it's also my honor for this to be the first time. I'm like, what happened? We're here in public?
No masks?
No mask, free. I have on mascara, the whole thing. What? So thank you for giving me reason to put on mascara again, which I haven't done in 2 years.
What do you think, you talk about, as a journalist, you're seeking out truth and then, stepping into this space. I wonder what are some of the truths you started bumping into once you moved into meeting people like Carl, thinking about activism? What are some of the truths that kept you?
Certainly we'll want Carl to unpack a lot of this further, but I think that one of the biggest things that literally stunned me, there were many, but the thing that stopped me in my tracks was about addiction, because nobody had ever said it, right? And I think that when I heard the statistic, rescue me here, Carl, is it 80 to 90% of people who use any drug, right? From cigarettes to alcohol to heroin, never become addicted. I was like, wait a minute, make it make sense. I'm from Brooklyn. I remember I stepped over the crack bottle. So we have that visual evidence or that lived evidence, and we think that that's actual evidence, right? We think our experience is world experience, or we think our experience somehow supersedes an actual scientific method. And when I read that, and then I thought again, I was like, hold on. Actually, I do know a lot of people who use this, that, and the other, and they're not. That was life-shifting for me, because it changed my own mores. As somebody who grew up in, my father wouldn't take a Tylenol. That was a drug. I literally asked my father, Carl, I was having a sneezing attack, an allergy attack. And I was like, can I have Benadryl? Get your own, and I'm like, we're not sharing drugs or whatever. It's like, I can get this over the counter or whatever. He was like that, grew up in a family like that. I know I'm not the only one.
Well, I was going to say, I remember, in high school, we had to, if we wanted to have Tylenol at school, we had to get our parents to write a note to say, we were allowed to take Tylenol on our own and have it, in our locker or something.
Which is funny, because Tylenol, which you can get over the counter, is probably more deleterious to your liver than good, clean heroin. But there that is. It's actually, I don't know, there might have been some science behind that. But, it's this thing about drugs, and it's just not true. So if that's not true, what else might they be lying about? What else might they be lying about? It's the critical thinking. Let me ask Carl. Let me be quiet.
Well, no. One quick question. This can be, and then you said a wonderful thing to bridge to Carl. Is who's the they in the what else are they lying about?
Anybody. It could be. Well, certainly we know the government lied.
The man.
And the woman. There's a whole bunch of them. The people, the non-binary, MFs, everybody. People just lie. And when they don't do it consciously, they just be talking. They're like, let me get in this conversation. Why? Like why? I don't want to hear from you. I'm not going to my plumber for like to tell me how to fix like a bridge I need in my teeth. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm going to the experts, but we don't go to experts on drugs. We don't go to experts on social scientists. We go to our homie. I don't get it. We wouldn't do that. Would you go? I will go to a bartender to have them make a drink, and my expectation is that you're gonna make the dopest drink ever. It doesn't always happen, but there's my expectation.
We're hoping.
Right. I'm like, if your bone was broken, if somebody broke their bone right now, are you gonna ask your bartender that? Maybe to make you feel better for a second, but you're gonna ask them to fix your bone. And that's what we do with these, with drugs, which is, it's literally killing us. How many more people do we need to have die? That's my question. Who are we willing to not have come home? I know what it feels like not to have people come home. Which one are we choosing? Because we refuse to talk to experts. So the they could be the person in your family that you're taking drug advice from, who's, has no idea about drugs. They're not a scientist, and they're not involved in the field, but they know so-and-so from down the way. It could be the people in the government. We know that it is. They've been proven. And unfortunately, too often, it is people in the media who elevate out of laziness, right? And the refusal to ask the next question, right? Because they want to keep a job. They want to get to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. They want access. We all do. Or we don't want to make our editor mad. All of those pressures are there. We got a family to feed. But somebody has got to stop, because if we don't, you're also choosing for somebody not to come home.
Yeah. So I want to get to all your uh-huhs, because you were feeling that. You were feeling that. But first, just to fill in the room, Asha was talking about like realizing that a drug conversation that she was having was coming from a lot of like anecdotes and people in the community. And I feel like you have a story of that was sort of your start in a way where you were thinking, oh, I saw drugs in my community, and you were very anti-drug and had like a certain stance and then switched. So I think that'd be a cool background for this room.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have that story. I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in Miami, and everybody knows of Scarface. If you haven't seen it, you know of Miami and the Cocaine Cowboys. Most of those stories are exaggerated, and they make great TV, great movies. But I came up in that era. And then I went into the Air Force between 84 and 88, and during that period, crack cocaine was introduced in the U.S., 85 or so. Crack cocaine, of course, is just smokable cocaine, but at the time, we were told that this was the drug that was the most dangerous, the one that was most addictive, and it was the one that was causing all of this urban violence. Mind you, between 1979 and 1980, we had our peak sort of murder rates, and 85 was not one of them. And mind you, 1982 was like the peak unemployment rate in the United States. But yet crack was blamed for all of these things, although crack was not even around at that time. I was fooled, like many people, so I thought one way I can contribute to my community is to tell people to stay away from drugs. And so as a young black man, there's always work for you when it comes to policing other black people's behavior. You know, like when the unemployment rate is low or bad in general, there's always work for black people to police other black people's behavior, even though there may not be work in the broader community. And so I was just like everybody else who were not thinking thinking that crack was the drug that was destroying the community, and drug addiction in general was a bad thing. So I started to study drugs. I pursued a PhD in neuroscience, trying to figure out how to understand the neurobiological mechanisms that were responsible for drug addiction, thinking that if I cure drug addiction, I can solve many of the problems in the community. But then after several years, couple decades of studying, I finally got an education and saw that the problems were there before any drugs were there, and the problems remained long after the hysteria surrounding crack had gone. And then a new drug was the new dangerous drug that we faced. And as Asha pointed out, the statistics related to addiction, the vast majority of people who use any drug are not addicts, and so that means we can't blame the drug. And then problems of unemployment, poor education, poor healthcare, all of those things are far bigger. But it took me more than 20 years to kind of figure this out, and that kind of brought me to this space.
There's sort of I feel like with drugs, a lot of times you hear like the addiction side of things, and that's something we really focus on both in coverage and in research and policy. But I wonder, like, what are the other areas of drug use that you're thinking about that aren't like addiction focused, and where either, well, let's just start there.
Yeah, so one of the things we have to do is just, I want people to understand that for the past 25 years or so, I get paid to give people drugs in a laboratory and study the effects. Drugs like crack cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana. And so this happens as a result of the taxpayer supporting this sort of thing. In order for us to have a database about what drugs do and what drugs don't do. So we know about all of these drug effects. And by and large, drug effects are quite boring. If you know the effects of alcohol, you know drug effects. But when we report on drugs as journalists in televisions, movies, you have to play up the drama, and in order to get people interested. And so that's why we play up all of the pathology, drug addiction, and all of the horrible things that can happen with drugs. But the vast majority of things that happen with drugs are positive. And that's the subject of the new book, to show people how we have been so biased. And there's a reason that we're biased, because there's money in being biased. But just think about it this way. Imagine if, when we talked about cars, we only talked about car crashes. Mm-hmm. That's what we do with drugs. Mm-hmm. That is really inappropriate, but it's okay to do that. It's still okay to do that with drugs. Particularly when it comes to, I mean, I just think about the New York Times recently ran an article about legalization. In what world can a reporter write a piece on some important topic related to health without getting the experts to weigh in? And that's what happened. German Lopez is the guy who wrote this piece. It's just, it's maddening, because, as Asha nicely pointed out, so many people are paying the price for that person's ignorance. And that sort of ignorance is elevated in places like the Times, and a number of places, not only the Times, you can Washington Post, you name it. They don't have to seek out expert.
So, like, just to help me understand what that article said, how did they write an article without going to experts? The author themselves was the expert, or you would argue that the people they considered experts were not?
The author is not an expert. The author is a journalist of some sort, covering a wide range of topics. And the topic was drug legalization. Mm-hmm. And so when you think about, and so the author only talked about drug legalization as a way to dismiss it, right? And so it's I wrote a whole book on these kind of things and didn't seek out any experts who really, I spent 30 years studying drugs, published in the scientific literature. A number of these pieces don't consult people like me. Now, I think we should just give the audience a sort of some background so everybody's at the same space. Oftentimes in the United States, when we talk about drug legalization, they confuse it with decriminalization. And so I just want people to understand the difference between drug legalization and drug decriminalization. Decriminalization is basically taking away the criminal penalties associated with personal use, small amounts, meaning that you won't go to jail, you might receive a fine, but you won't go to prison for infractions.
Is this like what we're seeing with weed across the country, or is that different?
It's different. So it's like thinking if you get a traffic violation, you won't typically go to prison, but you might have to pay a fine. But with drugs, sales of drugs remain illegal, whereas with legal regulation, it's treated like alcohol. Or if you are of the right age, you can buy the product and people can sell it. And importantly, you have quality control. That is, when you go and buy some alcohol in this country, you can be assured that it contains alcohol and no adulterants. Whereas when you're talking about buying things on the illicit market, you can't be sure of that. And so when you think about an article in the New York Times about drug legalization, without addressing the issue of, in this moment in our history, everybody's concerned about drug overdoses. Majority of drug overdoses occur for a few reasons. Drug contamination, people mixing multiple sedatives without realizing what's going on. Drug contamination can be taken care of with legal regulation because you have this quality control issue. We can think back to prohibition. During prohibition, alcohol between 1920 and 1933. Tens of thousands of Americans died or were maimed because of tainted alcohol. That situation changed in 1934 after we repealed alcohol prohibition. And so without having those kind of conversations when we're talking about drug legalization in this country today, it is irresponsible.
Yeah. Asha, I'm thinking about an article or an interview that you participated in where you were talking about Prince's death and fentanyl and like how if it had actually been like a clean drug, maybe the overdose wouldn't have happened. Does that ring a bell?
It does. I know exactly where I was when I learned that Prince died. The hope in doing that was to get people to think about what actually kills people. But let me take a step back to something that Carl was talking about. I'd love to go like a little bit back and forth with this. Yeah. And again, it's like a level setting. There's no history of any recorded society where people didn't get high. Let's just say what it is. Yeah. People get high. There is no legislation that is going to stop people from getting high. Whether people get high in a society with alcohol, whether they get high in a society with heroin, people are going to get high. And so the first part of drug use for grown-ups is facing the truth. Let's lay that out, all right? People get high, boom, that's it. Now, knowing that, and knowing that this has been the entire of human history, how do we respond to it? This is what Carl is talking about when we say drug checking, or that you don't have, or maybe I got ahead of myself, when you talk about drug contamination. We have no idea what's in things. So when Prince, who already felt as a man who grew up, and I think was still, you know, a practicing Jehovah's Witness. We're only 144 people, 140,000 survived. Everybody else going to the lake of fire. So, you know, who knows what was going on with that. But in any case, you know, here's a man who's 5'2", and so were his the heels on his boots. And I don't know if any of y'all had the pleasure of seeing Prince perform, but he was jumping off of speakers like as tall as he was and performing. If you haven't seen Prince perform live, you did miss something. I hate to break it. And he was in pain, extraordinary pain. His own religion, embedded in a society that is guided by false morality, didn't allow him to say, I'm hurting. Fentanyl and heroin are both great painkillers. And if you don't believe me, try living in the age of modern surgery without some kind of opioid. Try it. I'm not doing it. I'm not biting a bullet. I'm not taking a sip of rum for that. Right? I know people now who are coming out of surgery who won't take fentanyl because they don't. I'm like, but that's what you do. You're not going to be addicted, right? You're trying to relieve pain. Had Prince had the opportunity to not feel stigmatized, to claim the pain that you get when you're jumping off of speakers and doing the kind of extraordinary performance and movement that man who plays 17 instruments and danced as well as James Brown, truthfully, okay? That's how he moved. If he had had the opportunity to say, I'm in pain, what do I need? And a real scientist.
What if he just wanted to get high?
Well, he may have too. Yeah. But we do know he was in physical pain.
Yeah.
No, but he may have just wanted to get high.
I know, but that narrative, you only can use opioids when you were in pain. It's hard to disentangle pain, just pain from pleasure or pain from relaxation, anxiety, and it's okay. It is absolutely okay. So
it's Molly's fault because she asked about Prince, and I happen to think that Prince was in physical, but you're absolutely right. Pain is a full-bodied experience, right? So is pleasure when it's done right. If you know what I mean.
And but also, Carl, I mean, this is one of the things you talk about, right? Is that like we have certain narratives about drugs. Like you can use a drug if you're in pain, and what you're trying to do is like
but even
break
there,
that
even
narrative.
in the drug war, not necessarily.
Yeah.
Even there, the regulation is beyond the chain. I just want to say that. You know what I mean? Like even there, I've had to fight for it.
In pain.
But your point is right and well taken. I was limiting it to this one situation. I think you couldn't talk about it. But I think that for a host
but I think that's a good point because you have somebody like Prince, who has said for years that he never used drugs and he was clean, and so obviously I was dishonest, and so perhaps if people like Prince would have just come out and said, I'm using these drugs for whatever reason. He's in pain. He also has all of these high expectations people have on him. So we can understand why somebody like him might have done opioids. But just imagine how he might have been able to push this conversation forward. And so as long as, again, related to drug use for grown-ups, I ask people to get out of the closet. So people who will come here subsequent to us don't have to live in those shadows and don't have to put themselves at the same risk that somebody like Prince has.
I actually love that you're saying this. It's interesting. When I was at a former organization where I met Carl, I remember the first thing was to not assume that Prince had died of an overdose when it was obvious that there had been an overdose. So even being able to do the piece that I did was like almost taboo. But now that you're saying it, I'm thinking about this man who owned his own masters, this man who wouldn't let you say his name, the artist formerly known as Prince, Like, we're all like, we don't know, like, if we meet him, I'm a journalist, working in black journalism. Like, do I greet him like, how are you? Yeah, like, I didn't know how to, you know what I mean? Like, how would, not that I ever actually met him. It was like my fantasy thing in my head, like, what would I do? But, he wrote slave across his head. So I really, and also, he did Purple Rain. He tells you his story. So thank you very much for that point, and push it further. Like, people, even if you're not in pain, right, might use a drug because it's fun. I frankly have this little glass of wine right here, and I like to have wine. Although really more tequila because wine has carbs, tequila, the whole thing. But here we are. But because
Let's think about Michael K. Williams.
yes,
We did the thing
Yes.
in 2016. Michael K. Williams is, of course, the actor from The Wire, Omar, who died recently, what appears to be an accidental drug overdose. So Michael K. Williams' story was that he had once had a heroin addiction, but he was over it, he wasn't using, and so forth, and then he dies as a result of some accidental drug overdose. Now, imagine when we were doing these things, what was it, UNGAS, the United Nations thing?
Yes, in 2016.
In 2016, we were doing a drug policy sort of event with Michael K. Williams and other people. Imagine if they would have just come out of the closet and said, I mean, Michael K. Williams, great actor, responsible guy, one of the best actors of his time, certainly for what I think, and well respected. Imagine if he would have come out of the closet and said, your views about what somebody who uses heroin doesn't comport with reality.
that's right.
Oh, I'm gonna.
But he didn't.
Yeah, wait, let me jump in and just say, I mean, it's interesting because on the it's like I listen to you and I'm like, whoa, we're wrong. But then I think, are all those deaths because of a compromised drug or all those surely some of the deaths are happening because of something. I just wonder if there are multiple categories for why an addiction or an overdose can happen. And right now we're painting kind of like a rosier picture.
No. Let's just talk about that for a second. So, for one, when you say all of those deaths, again, I encourage people, please read the book. We think about how these deaths are counted. In the United States, death investigations typically are done by two groups, medical examiners and coroners. Medical examiners are physicians who might have some additional training in forensic pathology, whereas coroners, typically all you need is a high school diploma and be older than 18 or 21. And so those people really are not qualified to be doing these death investigations. And so they also are incentivized to count things as an opioid overdose, even though it probably wasn't. And they don't oftentimes even have biological confirmation of what actually killed the person.
What would incentivize them?
Grants. For example, there are grant funding for various coroner's office, medical examiner's office because of the opioid crises. And so you want to make sure that you have numbers in terms of people who might have died from an opioid overdose. So it's a very simple thing. Ask for biological confirmation. Ask, were there other drugs on board in the person's system? And what you will discover when you do have some biological confirmation that there might have been multiple drugs in the person's system. Do you think
the death is like the drugs interacting, not a singular drug?
I think that certainly, because it's not that easy to die from a drug like heroin. And when we talk about people who are addicted, people who have a tolerance, they are less likely to die from a heroin overdose. But we conflate these things in the media like, oh, someone was addicted and they died from an overdose. For me, the question is, wait, how did that happen? Look back up, because that's less likely to happen. But we act like it's more likely to happen. But that's because we don't ask the right questions. And so when we think about like Tylenol, because we brought Tylenol up, many people know about Percocet. Percocet is a combination between of Tylenol, acetaminophen, that is, about 325 milligrams and something like 5 milligrams of oxycodone. So a large dose of Tylenol, very small dose of an opioid, right? So if someone is seeking an opioid high from Percocet, these tablets, you will be required to have something like 10 or 20 of these pills to just to get some sort of nice high. But if you take 10 or 20 of these pills on multiple consecutive days, that's enough Tylenol to shut down your liver. And we never have this conversation when we're talking about drug overdoses.
But isn't that, in a way, a drug overdose,
That's
even though it's not the one they're intending?
Exactly.
And so what you're saying is, if we're going to report on it, make sure we're pointing at the right things.
Exactly,
Like,
because
people are pointing at the oxycodone, and you're saying, no,
it's the
point
Tylenol.
at the Tylenol.
Yes. So, like, if you go to a place like the UK, for example, you can buy over-the-counter this formulation of codeine and acetaminophen. You can buy this over-the-counter, 500 milligrams acetaminophen, 7 milligrams of codeine. On the packet, big letters, opioid, be aware of opioid addiction. That low amount of opioid in each tablet, you don't really have to worry about addiction, but you do have to worry about your liver with Tylenol. But that's not on the packet. And so, because the Tylenol is not sexy.
Interesting. Asha?
It's hard for me to say it any better than that, but I do want to underscore this, because you asked the question, Molly,
Yeah.
at the top. It was one of the things that surprised you. And I was listening to a board meeting many years ago. This is the other thing, that floored me, was you hit me with, and we weren't even like really friends then. I was like, he's a little grouchy, I don't know. But he's black, I'm Melissa, and ain't too many of us in this space. You were like, no, like almost nobody ever dies of like a single substance overdose. It's always polysubstance. I was like, what? Wait a minute, say it again. And what he was saying is that, like, as the crisis around overdose deaths, was just starting, we weren't really talking about it yet, but those in the field could see that this is where it was coming from. The question or the thing that shocked me was to know that you probably weren't going to die of heroin. And this question about these other additional substances, which in fact we know. That's why journalism is so important. You know how we know it? Remember when Whitney Houston died? Mm-hmm. They told you everything. What'd they lead with? Benadryl. And it was like Benadryl, it was this, it was that, it was like all of these many, many, many things that she had taken. Right? My mother wasn't mismedicated and killed from heroin or opioids. They gave her too much fucking Tylenol. She was too elderly to combat that. And it was obvious. She just had to look at her chart, look at her liver numbers. Right? That's what happened. She'd die of cancer or even old age, except old age probably didn't allow her to fight. She died of acute liver failure. It was over a period of 2 weeks during a pandemic when I couldn't be in there and be as annoying as I can be. I mean, good people don't find me annoying. but others do. I couldn't be there, right? I could only call and say, you don't give her one thing without me. It was Tylenol. That's what they were giving her as a painkiller. And I'm just saying, that these, as Carl is saying, like those conversations are not actually had. And when you do have them, you have people who respond in the extreme. So they'll never take a Tylenol. You know what I mean? And again, it's not science. And we're careful, especially in this society, right? We want to know everything. It's put in our what kind of water do we have? Is it, like my water, is, pH, whatever it is. We're so careful. But we're not careful about this prevalent substances in our society. Drugs are not good or bad. They just are. And go ahead.
Molly asked the question about us being too rosy, that issue. You raised
That's
this
me,
issue.
yeah.
Yeah, about us being too rosy. This is this sort of obligatory comment that the media feels like they have to say, which it's kind of ridiculous, really, because it's not being too rosy. These are just the facts. But you always have to do that because of our sort of moralistic society, and not just think about, we're just laying out the facts. This is not rosy at all. Now, if we want to talk about rosy, we can talk about, like Asha said, everybody, people have always gotten high. She said that in this general sort of way. But if we really break that down and, like, what does that mean? It means you feel magnanimous, you feel euphoric, you feel great. Now, we can really talk about the sort of predominant effects associated with drug use, because we can think about why would someone want to have an orgasm? Because it fucking feels good. That's what happens with drug use for the most part. And so, and not to say that unapologetically is adolescent. And I'm too old to be an adolescent or be treated like an adolescent. And I have no interest in being in a place that wants to force me to be an adolescent. I mean, I've raised, my youngest kid is 21. Why the hell do I want to be a child?
Yeah. I think a lot about the Grownups in the title of your book. Could you talk about what that word means to you? Because to me, it felt like, or at least my understanding was like, as a grown-up, you're responsible in a way, in the way you use drugs, and that it may or may not prevent you from getting to a point where you're another statistic or adding to statistics. So can you unpack grown up for me?
Well, the full title is Drug Use for Grownups, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear. And that subtitle is equally important. So drug use for grownups is just that. I'm pointing out that I'm drawing attention to the fact that I'm not talking about children. So when we have this conversation about drugs, one way we shut down the conversation is that people say, what about the children? What about the children? And when we think about a married couple, because they have young children, they don't stop having sex. And no one says, what about the children? You don't want those children to have intercourse at a young age. Yeah. But we don't expect the married couple to stop having sex. But when we have this drug conversation, we expect that to shut down the conversation. And so that's why Grownups was in the title. And in the book, I talked a little bit about how I see a grown-up for myself in terms of I meet all of my obligations, I contribute to my community, I volunteer, I do all of these things, my academic record, all of that sort of stuff I'll put up against anyone who's a scientist or who's an academic. So I just wanted people to understand this is not the typical bullshit story that you're accustomed to hearing. This is actually more representative. That's what the grown-up is for there. But the chasing liberty is critical, and people have, particularly journalists, they have conveniently ignored that subtitle. The subtitle harkens back to the Declaration of Independence, because in our country, we say that all of our citizens are guaranteed at least 3 birthrights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, meaning that you can live your life as you see fit, so long as you don't prevent others from doing the same. And so I'm bringing this sort of issue, or these liberties, to include drug use, and asking the question, like, how in the hell did we get here when we know our founding fathers, whatever you think of those guys, please think whatever you want, but the facts are, from Thomas Jefferson to Benjamin Franklin, they all used opioids, and they all enjoyed opioids, and they all claimed to have lived better lives for it, particularly towards the end of their lives. And so as a question for me became like, how in the hell we get here, where we are afraid to even acknowledge that feeling euphoric as a result of taking a substance is a good thing.
I want to invite people to come to the mic if you have questions, and we've got some people who have started, so we'll start integrating them.
And just as we
Yeah.
do that, though, Ma, I do want
Yeah.
to say something on this question of liberty. In our live audience, I see people, rightly or wrongly, who I mostly would identify as women. So I'm going to speak directly to those of you who do identify as women, and maybe in particular in this moment, to those of you who may want to have a child or not. Because this also, what Carl is raising, speaks directly to us who have been in this position. In November 25th, 2 weeks before the last UN gathering, women from around the world came to New York to stand before the sovereign land that is the United Nations and to demand that the global goal number 5, which was set forth in 2015, right, of 17 global goals that we were to achieve and are to achieve, right, as ratified by 100 or co-signed by 193 world leaders, was specifically about this question. Global goal number 5 is about women and girls. They talked about female genital mutilation, enforced marriage, women's representation equally in leadership, education, the right to health care, right? And what they called it was the right to bodily autonomy. Ultimately, this is what Carl's book, hold on, is about. It is the right for you, without doing harm to others, have the right to do with your own body. And if we didn't understand it before, we must understand it today. Because for those of us who live in states where the rolling back or evisceration of rights that allow us to decide, as Tupac said, when and where we can have a baby, right? And if we want to have a baby, right? Sorry, I was 90s girl, you know? So Tupac, I could have quoted, I can quote Jay-Z too, but people get offended at that sometimes. Whatever, I'm 90s Brooklyn. If we can't see that now, even in what was leaked in that draft, right? And see how we are thought of, if we can't see it, then I don't know what will. No other, I just try to think of a man, right? And people who identify as men not being able to control a bodily function. It's the fundamental, it is the core of medical ethics, your right to body sovereignty, right? This is enshrined. First, do no motherfucking harm. That's it. We take everything from that. This is what Carl's book is about. That's why liberty is in the title. That's why it's life-saving. And so...
It's not Republican or Libertarian.
No.
It's American.
It's not even American, right? It is human. It's just human to have the right to say, I'm going to do this with my body or not. I have the right to live or die. I have the right to go to the bathroom now. Right? Remember people who came up in schools like that when the teacher wouldn't let you go to the bathroom? And you had to beg for a pass?
They don't know. They're young.
Oh, my fault. My fault. I have bad memories. But,
You know, it was still like that when I was there.
I'm just like, it's just, and so this is what it is. And if drugs are not seen along that continuum of the right to choose your body and what you put in your body, then we don't have the basis for the honest and adult conversation about drugs, the ethical conversation, the human rights conversation. So thank you for letting me say that, and I have no idea how I remember those dates. That was by accident. That won't happen
Great.
again.
That was great. Can we do a question at the mic? Thank you, Asha.
Oh.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ilana. Thanks for being here. What do you wish were different about how the country educates children, high school students, college students about drugs and drug use?
So when I think about high school students in terms of drugs, the only drugs that you really want to be talking about are alcohol, tobacco, cannabis. Those are the only drugs. Those are the primary drugs that the high school students will use. And so you just want to make sure people understand the signs of alcohol poisoning, where people who do too much and they are inexperienced. With cannabis, you want people to understand that with inexperienced people, they might get paranoid or anxious, but just chill. The effects will go away. The drug interacts with the receptor and it will float away, but just chill. Just keep people calm. Tobacco, again, smoking something like tobacco, if kids have asthma. This is New York City. A lot of kids have asthma. Just want to be able to recognize the signs that I would worry about. And then when we think about drug education in college, I hope they have professors who use the book Drugs, Society, and Human Behavior, my textbook. I hope that the subject of drugs is being taught in a dispassionate, objective sort of way, and not this sort of judgmental, moralistic way, like making sure that we are not too positive about drugs. Silly shit, you know? But we do that in this country. And there's no reason to do that if you're just telling people how it happens, how to enhance pleasure, how to minimize the harms. But you have to acknowledge that that's why people take drugs, for the pleasure. Oftentimes we've been on this harm reduction trip and without talking about the pleasures. That's why people take drugs. And so I just hope people are objective and honest.
Thank you for that, Carl. I'm going to bring in a couple of things here, too, that I learned from Carl, and thank you so much for your question and your interest. Thank all of you. So one of the first things that I'll say is I would hope that they would talk about drugs in a balanced way. And by that, what I mean is there's such a heavy focus on drugs, right? Police in schools, and we experience it probably a little bit less in the Northeast, and I've heard my friends who grew up in the South, but I wish there was no kind of program that was dare-like. I wish the police were not the ones teaching kids about drugs who know nothing and can only teach it from a punishment perspective. And I wish they said what you said when we've had public conversations, Carl, that for black children, because I think you were edging toward questions about race before. Maybe I made that up. I felt like you were, but here we are. But for black children, right, the real danger with drugs is police interaction. That's it. You're probably not gonna die because, you had the trees, right? That's probably, I mean, unless it's laced with something that can, and you overdose on some poly. So, you're probably not gonna die just from smoking a joint or whatever. But you may die from interactions with police. You may die, walking home after you've gone to the store to buy something for your little brother, an iced tea. And while you're on the phone with a kid from your school who's being bullied, and you're trying to talk her off the ledge, and some man chases you down even after the police tell you not to, and what dominates the conversation in the media was that they found traces of cannabis. So what? First of all, cannabis ain't gonna make nobody do anything crazy like that. They're gonna chill you out, right? But so what? They said the same thing in almost every police-involved shooting, right? And they found it, as though that meant anything, as though that somehow contributed to the person's death. So I wish that they would talk about drugs fully as their experience. And most of all, I wish they would talk to young people in high school about the things that might drive to the misuse of drugs. And if you talked about that, like,
I don't think they should be having this conversation in high
not
school.
about drugs.
Yeah.
Not about drugs. I wish they'd talk about bullying.
Yeah,
I wish they'd talk about the hurt, right? I wish they would interrupt those things so a kid who, like I've known kids who have wildly misused stuff, usually alcohol. And if you got in where they were hurting and disrupted that, you might not have to have any other conversation. But they don't want to say shit. They want to do zero tolerance, throw kids out of school, and you're not talking to children about stress culture and disrupting that. You're not talking with young people about the things that are really troubling them. You're not asking them, how are you, and actually meaning it. And so if you were actually concerned about the misuse of drugs because for whatever reason, then maybe you might want to find out why, which is something else you talk about in your book, right? Like where are people at risk, if there is risk?
But the thing here is, like, when we talk about drugs, we reflexively go to this sort of concern about pathology, when in fact the majority of things that happens with drugs are positive. So I don't want to be in that space,
No, I know, I do, baby.
Because that's what we do as a society, and so like when we think about a balanced perspective, it's pseudo-symmetry. So
I mean balance in terms of like what actual role do drugs play in like if you having discussion.
I know what you mean,
okay.
but I just want to make sure they're clear about this issue of pseudo-symmetry. So like one of the things that they do in the media, they pretend that there are two equally weighted positions, when in fact all of the evidence should suggest this, but you have some other person on the other side who is just there to exaggerate or accentuate doubt. And now it just nullifies all of this evidence, and that typically happens with drugs. And so that's what I want to make sure that they are aware of, like real evidence versus someone just accentuating doubt.
That's absolutely right, and I think that what I wanted to get at here is this. I think that, and this happens with young people, and to me it happens broadly. As soon as you say the word drug, you don't have to have any conversation. And this goes back to some of your first work, right? In High Price. As soon as you say crack, you don't have to have a conversation about poverty. You don't have to have a conversation. Nobody, everybody else is absolved, right? Everybody else and everything else. And I feel like have real conversations with this whole human being for whom this is probably the smallest thing if you have the real conversation. And for black children, I have conversations about police. That's what I talk about. And I try to have, and the other final thing I'll say on that question that you taught me, Carl, was look at everything. So I never checked my daughter's phone. I never checked her diary. You know, first of all, I'm a deep believer in privacy, right? But I looked at all those things like you taught me. How are her grades? I'll just go ahead and drop. She finna graduate summa cum laude from Columbia on May 17th. You can give it up for that. Thank you. That's right. I just say that. But I'm not even trying to be shy about that brag. But, you know, there were so many things to check for, right? Was she imbalanced in all of these ways? So the question of drugs never would come up for me. It would never come up because everything else was working. Right? You see, that's what I mean, like, in talking with children. Check all the other shit. Yeah. Have you got to you know what I mean?
We don't want to talk too much about children. This is for grown-ups.
Oh, my fault.
Wait,
it's her fault. She asked the question.
I have so many follow-ups, but I want to hear from the folks in the room. So step on up.
All right. Hi, my name is Lyric. I'm a Sharp 40. So I know we talked a little bit about race, and so my question was about destigmatization and that journey. That's not the same for people of color, and so when journalists are covering this topic, how can we address this fairly while also noting that this doesn't look the same for everyone? What can we do to kind of address this gap?
What are you concerned about that doesn't look like that just doesn't look like everyone? Can you be more specific? Because I want to say that black journalists, non-white journalists, white journalists, they typically report the drug thing exactly the same. They get it wrong just like everybody else.
So I guess where I'm coming from, where I grew up in Ohio, it's very much solely about kind of the opioid epidemic. And so I guess the way it's covered, it kind of not only doesn't really include people of color, but when the coverage does, it's just done poorly in the sense that, like, I feel, how do I explain it?
I think I understand a little bit. So there's this nonsense notion or narrative out here that we somehow cover the opioid crises different than when we covered the crack crises.
Yes.
It's nonsense. We cover it exactly the same. Mm-hmm. In that we've always, even with crack, during that crack era, we've always kind of made excuses for, like, the white executive on Wall Street. They go to treatment, whereas we are harsh with the black user. They go to prison. Similar things is happening today, but except today, we kind of have run out of just the black folks. I mean, you go to places like Oklahoma, they arrest, of course, they arrest black folks there. They're also arresting a lot of white folks. Same with Ohio. And then you think about the consequences of our policy, our views. There are a number of people in the country who are chronic pain patients, and they can't get their medication, so they're paying the price. So everyone, more people are paying the price, but this nonsense about how we're covering this differently, we're not covering this differently. We're covering it equally poorly, and bad policies are occurring as a result of how we're covering it.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a follow-up?
Yeah.
I'm also curious of, like, in your question, because this was something on my mind when Carl and Asha were talking earlier, if there's anything about like Carl, when you were sort of talking about people stepping into the light and sort of like admitting, like, I do heroin, I do crack, I do cocaine or whatever, you know, like just saying that. I wonder, thinking about your question, like if that stepping into the light is different for a black person who's saying it or a white person who's saying it. And you brought up stigma, and I was thinking, is that another point where you're coming from of like how as a journalist?
You know the answer
No,
to that question.
No, I know the answer to that question, but what I'm saying is she's saying as a journalist, if you're asking someone to step into the light, but you know that the reception of them is going to be different based on the color of their skin, how do you ask that question?
Let me try to address some of that. Lyra?
Yes.
As a young journalist, one of the first things I was taught is that every journalist is an investigative journalist. We tend to parse it out, and we think about opinion writers or sports journalists, or right? But every journal, I don't care what you do, you're an investigative journalist. That used to be the standard. Now, you know, of course, people call themselves journalists because they blogged on whatever, microblog. It doesn't matter. And so I think that what we have to ask are the questions that other people aren't asking. If you're covering a spate of overdose deaths, right? Because it's less than, I don't like to call it an opioid crisis. It's an overdose crisis. And why is that? Yep. What else is going on, right? And I think that, so I never call it a crack epidemic. I call it the Reagan epidemic, right? It's the total removal of social safety nets. It's the imposition of laws. More cocaine was used and sold, be it in crack form or in powder form, was used and sold on Wall Street. Right? It doesn't fall apart. They chose Wall Street. They didn't choose Washington Heights. They didn't choose Brooklyn, and you know where so many of the people who were incarcerated at that time came from. So ask the questions that other people aren't asking. Be an investigator. Be an investigator. Ask more, right? Ask more, because when you dig into something, those questions will unfold. What else was happening?
Asha, I'm confused. I still want to understand her question and the way you put it, Molly. So are we saying that if you're asking this, let's say a black person, to step into the light, as you put it, versus a white person? Is that the question? And are we worried about the differential risk? What do we? Well, I want to understand the question.
So it is kind of like a broader question, but so there's that facet as well. It kind of stemmed when you were talking about Prince and that stigma of, like, you know, trying to be able to come out and express one's,
like Prince versus, say, like another white artist.
There's that, but also I've seen in news coverage, at least kind of where I'm from, white people who do drugs, when there's an overdose, it's painted more as like a sad story, and black people are demonized for it.
Yeah. So you just described America, and so like you, as a black man in this country, I understand that people treat me differently. I mean, here it is. I have 30 years of experience of drug research, published in the finest journals, tenured professor at an Ivy League institution. I write a book on my subject matter and the way I was painted in the media. I understand that had a lot to do with race. But I'd be stupid not to understand that what country I live in and what kind of people these folks are. And any black person who survives in this country already knows that. And I know the risk that's involved. And I understand that my heroes took risk. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to be here. So I accept the risks as they are. And so this notion as if there is no risk, that's a pipe dream, and you're not going to be successful anyway if you think that there is no risk, or if we don't expect people to take risks. And so I think that the whole conversation about risk is a moot issue, because successful people already know that, and they've already taken all kinds of risks, and they've already dealt with the consequences of those risks.
But I still think there's a and also I still think there's a responsibility for journalists. If you look at most coverage, also, they'll lead with, like, the police, according to police, things like, I already dismiss you when you start with that. I already know you about to lie. You know what I mean? So our responsibility and part of reducing that risk is to tell the whole story. And lazy ass journalists don't do that. They won't even call you, let alone come see you. They'll email you some questions. I would never do that. I'm doing your job when I get asked, right? So ask the whole piece, because then it makes it safer. Stigmatization goes away in part around different things when we choose. And we know that, right? If we just talk about the question of abortion, remember when women did that? You know, when they did the whole thing about I had an abortion because, right? What if they had done that in 1973 when we called it pro-choice? What if you actually said the goddamn word? I'm just saying. So we have to begin at the beginning by saying it. And those of us who have most of the skin in the game, as Carl is correctly pointing out, have to take the risk and say it. For journalists, our job is to tell a whole truth, because that in part is what reduces the harm to people who are brave enough to take the risk, as Carl was here in this book.
Thank you so much for your question and digging into it. Next up.
Hi, I'm Maya. Thank you guys so much for being here. I'm also Sherp 40 with Lyric. My question is, I think there's a lot of cynicism in America around drug regulation and purchasing, selling right now, especially following everything with Purdue and the opioid overdose epidemic. So my question kind of is, in a situation with broad legalization, how can we make sure private companies don't exploit drug prescription?
Have we been successful with that in anything?
Thank you.
I don't think that's been successful anywhere. I think that if we can be successful with that in drug legalization, wowzers, and let everybody take a lesson. I don't know that that's happened anywhere. But what we can do is set a standard, right, and maintain it, and not hold drug legalization hostage to a standard nobody else meets. Drug legalization is drug regulation. The question in our mind should be, do we want people coming home? To me, that's it. Is it safer or not? I don't want people going to jail for body sovereignty. Right? I don't want people punished for that. And I for sure don't want people dead. Drug legalization does reduce the incidence of that. It may not be perfect. This is a race. This is a white supremacist nation. Always has been. It's a patriarchy. Always has been. So what we do with drugs isn't going to resolve its corporatization either. But it will reduce the harms that we know, the death. It will reduce that.
There's also there are some flaws in the assumption that in your question, because you loosely tied Purdue, opioid crises. There are so many flaws in that just basic assumption. It is true that companies like Purdue were aggressive in their marketing of some of their products, like oxycodone. That's absolutely true. They do that with a number of compounds. But then when you think about those kind of medications and the role that they actually play in overdose deaths, that's highly questionable. I mean, when you look at evidence, like when you see, the number of prescriptions for opioids dramatically decreasing, but you still see the number of overdoses continuing to rise. You know, I think we have more of a sort of crises of accounting our numbers, what we're calling drug overdoses. I think that's where the real problem is. Now, the issue of legal drug regulation doesn't have anything to do with what you were just talking about. And drug legalization is an issue of, I mean, for the country, it's like, do you want to live up to your ideals? That's number one, the ideal of this issue of liberty. And if we know that there are people who are dying from tainted substances, we know that regulating the market will deal with that. Some people think about drug legalization like it's a free-for-all. It's not a free-for-all. I mean, people, you have more control over the market because you have age requirements, you can have other requirements, and so the two are not together, as you put it in the question. And when you ask the question like that, you're sure to get the wrong answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are out of time, and so I just feel like we've all learned so much about how to communicate with each other, how to ask questions, how to follow up questions, and let's just keep the conversation going. There are drinks. I think I saw knishes, and water. And so thank you so much, Carl. Thank you so much, Asha. Thank you, Caveat. And then everyone have a great night.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Asha.